Hello, this is Matthew Errett, and you're here for another Canadian Patriot podcast. With me today is my good friend John Helmer, who is a journalist. He's somebody who has a very interesting career stretching back quite some decades. And I'm just going to say a few things, just reading John's bio. For many of you who are listening, if you don't already know, John is John's main website is Dances with Bears. You can find that at johnhelmer.net. John's bio reads that he has served on the staffs of several leading figures in the past 40 or so years, including U.S. Presidents Jimmy Carter, Greek Prime Minister Andreas Papandreou, Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, and I always get his name wrong every single time. He was also an official advisor to Prime Minister J.R. Jayawardene of Sri Lanka. Am I getting that Prime Minister's name right, John?
Jayawardena.
Okay.
Jayawardena. That's how it's pronounced. Equal stress on all the syllables.
Okay. I guess you had a lot of time to practice. And as a lawyer, he has run cases in the district and federal courts in Washington, D.C., in Moscow City Courts, the Victorian Supreme Court, the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal, the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal, and the Melbourne Magistrates Court. He has also been an advisor to defense teams in the UK High Court. As a journalist, he is the longest continuously serving foreign correspondent in Moscow and the only Western journalist to direct his Moscow bureau independent of single national or commercial ties, which he opened in 1989 originally. John, that is quite the exceptional biography. And I got to just ask you, before we begin just commenting and discussing some of your recent writings and analyses, as well as the world situation, especially since the Russian counter attack in the wake of the Kerch Bridge sabotage, I'd like to know, first of all, I mean, there's a lot of questions, but when the term Moscow, an independent bureau journalist from Moscow, what does that mean? You were not affiliated particularly with any newspaper outlet or anything. You were just based in Moscow and you were providing journalism and analysis to various other outlets around the world, or how did that work for so many years?
Well, it worked historically, Matt, but let me thank you for the introduction, and let me say it's really a pleasure to be back in Montreal or Montreal. It's been quite a long time. It's one of my favorite Canadian cities, and I've got very sweet memories of having been there as long ago as the World Expo, as I recall it, in 1967, when I met a very interesting group of people, and whose company, through a month or two in Montreal at that time, it was the summer of 67, so it's a long time ago, have always encouraged me to think that it would be nice to come back to Montreal, but there's only part of me coming back to the city today, and so thanks for inviting me back. As for how it worked, you might say I've had a career of working for political losers. Whitlam in Australia was destroyed and defeated and removed in November 75. Everybody knows what happened to Jimmy Carter but in the short-lived single-term administration between 77 and 1980. And then Andreas Papandreou served for 2 terms and then was defeated in the elections that ran between 88 and 92 and later sadly died. So after all those political defeats, you might say, and they were serious ones, they did permanent damage to those countries. And I include the United States in that. Serious damage to the political cultures and serious damage to the quality of the democracy of those countries. I went on to the then Soviet Union and arrived around 1989. And the only way I thought to stay was to set up a bureau that offered coverage from Moscow at a lower price, essentially, than it cost. At that time, at the end of the Soviet Union, or the last days, the last years of the Soviet Union, you could do what I was proposing to do, but nobody else had done it. And you could do it at a lower cost, a lower establishment cost. News media of the established kind used to have fork out about $250,000 in office expenses and cars and hirings of all sorts. And I was offering to do it much cheaper. Of course, at the time, and I'm laughing about it now, but imagine this, at the time I started, you weren't a journalist, a foreign journalist, once accredited, was not allowed to transmit through his own fax machine. We used to transmit by fax. And so I used to have to take a metro across town. Moscow's a rather big town, but a rather good metro system, to the single official fax where you had to file the copy and pay the bill and obviously get monitored, censored, watched, not censored, but watched and monitored as you sent out the fax material. So everything required me to prepare the text, take a 1 or 2 hour trip across town, fax it to whichever newspaper happened, and that's how it worked. Fairly primitive, but it was a one way of learning my way around the town. And the way it worked, various subscribing newspapers or media groups joined in. The Singapore Straits Times, Business Times joined. So I was the first to cover Moscow directly for Singapore. Subsequently Bangkok, Australia was another subscriber, and so on, and it expanded over the years. But then this partly reflects the history of the political history that everybody knows during the early years of the Yeltsin administration. And well, let's go back. The fall of Gorbachev happened outside my kitchen window when two very large military forces assembled in the area that was visible outside of my apartment kitchen window, first in 91 and then again in 96. The political history of the fall of Gorbachev and the rise and fall of Yeltsin was a short period of time in which most Western media, Asian or Australasian or European or American, because I went to work ultimately for the Journal of Commerce in New York, and Platts Metals, also a McGraw-Hill publication in New York. The interest in political turmoil in Russia quickly waned, and what came instead was interest in how each country or each economy was doing or might do business with the new Russian economy. So that led me to becoming a specialist in, or having to become a specialist in Russian business sectors, diamonds, precious metals, platinum and gold, the steel, ferrous metals, non-ferrous metals like aluminium, and so on and so on, and insurance, shipping, and with a bit of luck, and I needed luck all those years. There was plenty of bad luck too. The portfolio of independent subscribers and media expanded, and I had to become and I had to learn the businesses of all these specialized media. And that introduced me to Africa and South Africa, because South Africa, as everybody understands, is one of the world's great producers of diamonds, gold, and the platinum group metals. And in 94, apartheid collapsed and was replaced by the Mandela government. And so I began to make the acquaintance of my very good friends in South Africa, and I became South Africa's correspondent. And that was the first African direct news bureau representing interests in Africa in Moscow. So that's how it happened. And a lot of it was happenstance, a lot of it was luck, a lot of it reflected the change of political and business and economic conditions in Russia. And that's the sequence.
That I really do appreciate that context. It does add a lot of meat to the bones. And you were just in the middle of a period of rich history, which saw major battles being waged. At what point did you pick up on the fact that that there was an intention ultimately by the victors of the Cold War to undo effectively the existence of Russia throughout the 1990s and beyond that? At what point did you realize that there was this other geopolitical agenda behind the business talk and things of that sort? Was that something you picked up on early, or was that a little bit later after the color revolutionary launches of Georgia and Ukraine in 2003 and 2004 that you began to understand that?
It's a good historical question, and it allows me to say I forgot to mention the way I got acquainted and integrated in the Canadian press system. I became the Canadian correspondent in Moscow for Canadian business for Guess Who, the Globe and Mail.
Oh, wow.
And Guess Who was my editor in Toronto. It was the person now known as Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland.
My God.
Now, my job or my role was at the time to cover a very burgeoning and prosperous range of Canadian companies, gold miners, construction companies, diamond mining interests, the Canadian the Toronto stock market companies that were interested in floating into Russia, and a whole range of other Canadian business interests. It was my role to cover and report on them, and through them, I used to have regular and good and happy personal contacts with the embassy, with various ambassadors like Jeremy Kinsman and others. And I was an annual attendant to the Canadian Summer Lobster Feast, and good stuff that kept us all well informed about what Canada was doing in Moscow. There was a very good and very active business club led by some people who did some very interesting business in Canadian exports of meat to the Russian market, and so on. Now, your question was, when does I become aware of the political agenda? Well, Ms. Freeland, as an editor, was very active in promoting her version of the political agenda. She always was. She still is. It's the same political agenda. And she also used her customary way of dealing with people she disagrees with, who don't accept her agenda or don't think her agenda has got anything to do with the truth, which is to scream semi-hysterically at people and try to insult them, intimidate them, and cower them into silence. Well, doesn't work very well with a lot of folks. It might work in Ottawa. It didn't work with me. And there was at the time considerable diversity of Canadian opinion, both at the embassy and in the Canadian business community, as to what the truth of the matter was on the ground, whatever Chrystia Freeland had to say about it. But ultimately, the people who prospered in their account and their narratives of Russia in the Globe and Mail were people whose bylines I won't mention right now. Some of them, the so-called distinguished foreign correspondents, made a career of sucking up to Russian oligarchs and promoting them throughout the late 1990s and into the 2000s. They don't, I shan't mention their names. Now they probably aren't even ashamed of the way they reported so favorably about individuals, and they now castigate as evil cronies of an evil regime. But let's go back to your good question, Matt. The political agenda in Moscow was visible from the beginning. But it was visible to me because I'd come in, as your intro indicated, from countries that had experienced semi-political revolutions. In Australia, the government had been toppled there in what's known as the constitutional coup of November 1975, for which Jimmy Carter's administration had apologized to the Whitlam veterans for having been part of and instigated and authorized the CIA plot to change the government of Australia in Canberra in November 1975. In Greece,
right, and that was in regards to Whitlam's efforts to do something about the Five Eyes operations in his backyard, right?
There were a lot of factors, but that was one of them. Yes.
Okay.
That was part of the culmination, but there were many things involved in the run-up to that, and there were many things involved in Malcolm Fraser, the Tory leader who took over from Whitlam, and his plot to seize power. Malcolm Fraser, before he died, saw things differently, and we had a long talk before he died somewhat later, and not allowed to talk about that while he was alive, and one of these days I will talk about what he had to say then. But yes, that had happened. So you could say I'd experienced a political putsch of one kind in 75. Then what happened during the Carter administration is a rather well-known story of a somewhat different kind, including direct experience of Zbigniew Brzezinski as a plotter and schemer of one of the most diabolic kinds in recent US history. And then during the Greek government, the Andreas Papandreou's government, the PASOK socialist government of 1982 to 89, there were periodic attempts to overthrow Papandreou in various ways, some of which I've written about. And so I came to Moscow with a very clear set of experiences of how a government can be toppled. I leave out Sri Lanka because that was different then. And there was no, the trouble that was experienced in Sri Lanka until very recently has all been self-inflicted, disastrously, fatally so for the people of Sri Lanka. But when Gorbachev self-destructed, when the Yeltsin takeover took place, it became very clear what the US agenda, what the NATO agenda was and would become. And this would be reflected in some of the media editorial directions. Moscow was then a vibrant democracy. Arguably, you can still see more dissent, opposition, criticism, and press activity in Moscow than you can see in London or Paris. That may surprise a lot of folks, but that's the reality if you look closely. Mm-hmm. What happened was that English language newspapers flourished immediately. The Moscow Times appeared, the Moscow Tribune appeared, and subsequently the Russia Journal appeared. 3 English language papers publishing in Moscow at the same time, competing with one another. That's pretty remarkable. It doesn't exist any longer, but at that time, it's very clear, and I've written for, was correspondent of all of them. The Moscow Times, however, turned out to be a front, first of all, for US Secret Service funding, and then subsequently for Russian oligarch funding, particularly Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Now the Moscow Times, what's left of it, the bare bones, to use your term, Matt, is paid for by the Dutch Foreign Ministry. But during the time I was with the founding of the Moscow Times, we were, and I was specifically told to always refer to the parliamentary debates as the communist-led Russian parliament and so on, until I got fed up with this and said, this isn't the truth. This is what I'm going to write. If you don't like it, you can shove it. And so I got shoved. That's the way it usually works, isn't it? And I was paid not to write for the Moscow Tribune until non-compete period expired, and then I became the writer for the Moscow Tribune. Moscow Tribune had an interesting Canadian connection, and because the sort of managing secretary of the paper was a person called Janice Cowan. Janice Cowan subsequently wrote a book about being a Canadian spy in Moscow at the time. I won't spoil her story, but her husband was the senior Canadian military attaché in those years. And Janice has described how she was a spy for Canada, but during the time she worked for the Moscow Tribune. Well, I hope she learned stuff, but Canada took a completely different interpretation of Russian intelligence and Russian information then than it's subsequently done, since Ms. Freeland took over the agenda in Ottawa. But that's another story. The agenda was open at the Moscow Tribune, as it was in Ajay Goyal's Russia Journal. The agenda was closed and oppositionist in the Moscow Times. And that's from the very beginning.
Wow.
And then everybody will understand that during the privatization period, which began very quickly, there was a very powerful drive, and not simply from US business interests or Canadian business interests, but the British had all sorts of interests which they reflected in the press. Somebody like, for example, and the way these interests reflected would be through the press. So the Financial Times correspondent, a man called John Lloyd, was married to, at the time in Moscow, to a lawyer working for a British law firm that was extremely active in promoting not only legal fees, but privatization of assets in the direction of its British clients and its multinational corporate clients. So Lloyd's reporting for the Financial Times bore an interesting resemblance to the interest of his wife as a lawyer advising, I believe her law firm was then Norton Rose, and I believe they subsequently divorced. I don't know anything about the family life of the Lloyds, but there was a relatively small Western press community, and one understood the way in which the editorial line for privatization, for the transformation of Russia in one direction, was being expressed through the media, and then in parallel through the stock exchange and through the government administrations of the time.
Right. And so, yeah, you did not go into this with any naivete. You had already become wise to the ways of the world that you were actually operating in at a much earlier stage than many other people in a similar situation.
Let's just say I was miserable. I wouldn't say wise. I would say I was already prepared to be miserable and to detect that Russia would go in the same direction that these other states I'd been in. And just in case I wasn't miserable enough, a couple of interesting American guys, Matt Taibbi and Mark Ames, created another English language newspaper called The Exile. The Exile began to appear in competition with the others. And Matt and Mark, who've become much better known since then, created a semi-annual competition for the worst Western journalist in Moscow, the prize for which would be a pie made out of horse sperm, often delivered in the face. This was a contest to show, and it's to the credit of Mark Ames and Matt Taibbi at the time, that they showed how biased, how interested, how ideological and doctrinal Western media coverage of Moscow was at the time. So that the Exiles semi-annual tournament for the worst Western journalists was in fact an expose of ideological bias, of business interested planting of stories and that sort of thing.
Oh, that is interesting. I didn't realize that. Huh. And so I guess I wasn't intending necessarily to bring the conversation into this direction, but since it is organically moving here, this thought then enters my mind. I know you've spoken to me briefly about this, as well as having written about this in the past on several occasions. You mentioned that you were the longest serving foreign correspondent, and in this time you made a lot of enemies. You're no longer based in Russia, and I was wondering if you, how, maybe without naming too many names, but would you like to say something about? I'm curious. How was it that you found yourself needing to leave Russia at a certain point when things were no longer quite safe for somebody of your character and moral disposition?
Well, I think I'd change the terms a little bit. I didn't need to leave, Matt. I was forced to leave.
Right.
The circumstances are told in the first book. It's called the first autobiography of my time in Russia. It's called The Man Who Knew Too Much About Russia. I was the target of an assassination attempt. And that was associated with an attempt in one of the foreign stock exchanges to float a well-known Russian aluminium company. The details were not only retold in the book, but they came from Freedom of Information Act files about the case, which appeared in my lap sometime later, and some, I'm glad to say, news reporting by some of the Murdoch media, believe it or not, of the attempt to kill me. After that failed, I was issued a ban order that was associated with the purported denial of the renewal of my accreditation. My accreditation, this is sort of an annual procedure in Russia, had been since Soviet times, had been routine, and then it was stopped. And then I was chucked out. I was originally advised, this is only to cancel you as a reporter, you can come back as a visitor, as a tourist, and so on. The fact was I was banned, persona non grata, and required within days to leave my home, my wife, my family connections, my cat, and up stakes and move. And that's what happened. And that reflected basically the line of business reporting, which was accurate. It can all be read in the archive, and it triggered serious conflict with vested Russian interests. But I have to say that over those years, many Russian media developed the competence in the business sectors and the sources and the discipline to report independently and honestly too. I can't say that. A comparable learning process occurred in the Globe and Mail. It went into reverse. Financial Times went into reverse. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, they all went into reverse, and now they're in another world now. But during the 1990s, those press outlets and their correspondents were fair game for their national business interests to plant stories, as well as their embassies. As you said at the intro, Matt, I was independent, and I guess I got invited to all of the national days, including some countries whose national day I wouldn't have recognized. and whose national foods were kind of tasty because I'd never known them before. But that was that was just cocktail party chatter, and every national capital has the same. No, my base for learning, let's put it that way, and therefore the base for understanding how a country runs was Russian business, whether it was the diamond mines operating at minus 45 in Yakutia in the Far East, or gold mines or nickel mines in the far north, or the extremely interesting operations of the aluminium trade between Russia and China. That's how I learned how Russia was working, the new Russia. And these reporting had to be at a high quality of truthfulness, because the market reader of aluminium or metal news, or the market reader for diamond news, or the market reader in the shipping business, these are small groups of people, maybe somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 at most, based in London, depending on the nature of the business. London for insurance, let's say, different ones based in Wall Street. These are people who know a crappy, false, planted story if they see it. They're always the discipline of business, the discipline of risking money, is to require the truth, and to require the truth faster than the rest of the market. That's the way business dynamics work. And I had to learn how that worked. It's faster than politics, as I'd experienced it. And it's at least as exacting as military intelligence, but it's not spying, it's business. It's money. And when folks want to risk money, they want to know what's true, what's false. Because if they lose their money, they've lost more than the truth. They've lost their shirt. And so I had to learn all this. And I learned it at the same time that my Russian press colleagues were learning how a press works in a relatively unrestricted environment, as Moscow was. So they learned, and I learned together.
Right. Well, I guess that is definitely something that is a valuable capacity to see beyond the surface narratives, where we're often told that we have to presume that the world is shaped by the surface appearance of nation states negotiating, making peace, making war, serving their own national interests, without a deeper appreciation for what really goes on behind the scenes, that one can only know by being very rigorous, mentally disciplined, and also appreciate where the real, or many of the more powerful levers of decision-making actually happen, which is located in, as you pointed out, in business negotiations, business interests, which obviously have a lot of overlap with government, but it's not simply just this cartoonish, one-dimensional, it is this government versus this government or something like that. So definitely you tuning your mind to this reality definitely puts you in a very strong position. And I could see by your website, I mean, I've told people for a number of years now, you came on my radar, I think in 2011 or so. And your website just stood out, and your ability to appreciate a full spectrum analysis with various parameters taken into consideration, from the business side of things, economic, industrial, as well as military analysis and basic geopolitics. Every single component you have a good grasp of, and also you're not locked into one country or another. And I think that just being the consequence of you having just journeyed and worked all across the world, you found a way to look at the world as one chemistry, and to situate a context for your analysis of various parts. Russia being one of the most specialized things that you've really spoken about, but so much more. Originally, it was a colleague of mine, Rachel Douglas, who told me about you, and I was really impressed. So today, I mean, many people, I should say, were caught a little bit off guard over the past 24 hours, especially since the Kerch Bridge suffered its sabotage. We don't know all of the details. We know certainly that it was not Russia that did that to themselves. That was one thing we could definitely rule out. The response, the retaliatory response that was taken indicates a completely new quality of tactics that many people did not expect, with Russia conducting a vast assault on a variety of targets in Kiev and many other locations. You were not surprised. I could see that because one of your most recent articles from Sunday, October 9th, before this even happened, was Russian army fires Old Sparky, US loses the electric war in the Ukraine. You were already very sensitive to the reality of the role of energy systems. Could you say a little bit something about that article, that analysis piece that you put together, and what you think Russia has been thinking? What is the plan behind the current shifting of gears?
Well, let's begin with a qualifier, Matt.
Sure.
I don't talk about the battlefield. There are several reasons for this, but we have a very serious war in Europe. It's a continuation. If you go back and look at the history of the archive of stories, and I don't expect the radio audience to go back and look at all this old Helmer stuff. But this is the continuation of the war that stopped in Europe in 1945. It's the war to overthrow the government in Moscow and produce a Russia that will no longer threaten to form an alliance with Germany and create a strong Europe in potential conflict with the NATO alliance led by the United States. All that's obvious. It's obvious to me, and I've been trying to report the military side of it since placed the Ukrainian regime with the Poroshenko one, and then the Zelensky one. Not surprise is not something I want to take credit for, because I try to avoid talking about the battlefield, and I certainly try to avoid speculating about what will come next. Also, I think it's time for us to realize that how dangerous this war is for the survival of all of us. So it's best not to get too angry, hot under the collar, and express that in journalism or in any other way, in a pub or anywhere else for that matter. So what has been very clear for some time, and it's no surprise Russian officials have been making this clear for some time, that the threat to Russia, the common new term is existential. It's Russia's survival that's at stake. This, the way out in negotiating terms, no surprise, was offered in December 17 of last year, when the Foreign Ministry published two proposed non-aggression treaties, one for the United States, one with NATO. Both were rejected. You read all the details later or never. But the point was that through January, there were attempts to negotiate the terms of those non-aggression treaties so that the Ukraine would not be a gun platform that would threaten Russia, nor Poland, nor Romania, where nuclear-capable missile bases can fire at Russia's capital and also its strategic nuclear capability within, as Putin had said several times over, between 7 and 12 minutes. Those are significant direct security threats. So we were escalating slowly on one side, trying to negotiate on the other side, until we came to February the 24th. February the 24th, as you all know, was the beginning of the special military operation. And we've tried to show how its phases were broadened by the extent to which NATO, especially Canada, led by such generals as Trevor Cardieu and led by such arms generals as Chrystia Freeland, have launched what was once her grandfather's war against the Soviet Union, the war of Galicia controlling the Ukraine, to topple Russia. Now, in that military situation, the Russian method for planning is not personal. The focus, the demonization of President Vladimir Putin is a Western allied propaganda tool. In fact, there is a much broader advisory system, and the direct staffing of military, strategic, and security planning is well known. I call it for short by its old Tsarist name, its Stalin War name, the Stavka. The Stavka's planning has always anticipated what comes next. The foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has pointed out that if the NATO side uses the Ukrainian gun platform to fire long-range artillery and rockets, the HIMARS weapon system, for example, then Russia's defense of itself and its Russian-speaking allies in the Donbass must extend to the range of those weapons. So the range of weapons, this has been said publicly several times over, must extend westward by the range of those weapons, or the Ukrainians and their NATO allies come to the negotiating table and we achieve a peace that involves demilitarization, removing the threat to Russia that the gun platform called the Ukraine presents. So that moved the campaign 300 kilometers to the west. Now, the Ukraine is a much bigger place than people realize, and 300 kilometers from the contact line doesn't get you quite to Kiev. And then you've got a long way to go between Kiev and Lvov on the west and the Polish border further west. So as the war on the NATO side, thanks to armor specialists and artillery specialists like former General Cadieux, who has disappeared, as you all know, facing rape charges in Ontario. Generals on the NATO side developed various plans, which now come to a new phase. And the phase is to move westward. And I've reported this, but I haven't been anticipating, speculating, or expressing a view about how the battlefield will go. All of this is clear if people do the one thing the Western media don't allow you to do, which is to read what the Russians say.
Yeah, no, I know there's all of these Putin whisperers trying to make their careers commenting on what Putin is actually intending behind his words, but they don't actually just say look at what he is saying and then compare it to the actions taken. And it would be so easy to get a sense of how do you put out this fire? How did this fire even come into being in the first place? And as you pointed out, Putin has worked very hard with his allies to provide escape routes for those unipolarists in the West who are pulling themselves into a quagmire by propping up their little puppet regime in Kiev to get something that has no place whatsoever in a world that actually is going to have any form of peace. And in one of your recent articles, you make a point that this war is something you understand as having started 8 years ago, not a few months ago, the way many people are being led to believe. Can you say a little bit about why you framed it as the war against Russia began 8 years ago in your recent piece on whose cat caught the German tongue?
Well, in 2014, sorry, this is going to sound a bit nasal to the audience, and that's because when we talk on these subjects, a certain amount of phlegm rises from one part of me and goes into the top of my head, and I begin to either squeak or I begin to sound phlegmatic, and I'm trying to sound a bit phlegmatic without sounding as if I've got a cold in the nose, because phlegmatic is the only way you can deal with the very long sequence. The sequence try regime change in Moscow takes place. The earlier US idea of an alliance between successors to Hitler, the German army, and the Allies to go against Stalin, that started in about 1943, and it failed because Hitler survived the assassination attempt that is well known, and then survived until the Russian Red Army got rid of him in the occupation of Berlin. From then on, you have a history of so-called Cold War operations. Chrystia Freeland's grandfather was recruited as a Ukrainian spy by the United States Army. He had already been spying against his own people for the German army and was in Bavaria, where he had the child that is Chrystia Freeland's mother. He was actively involved in this new war against the Soviet Union, and that's gone through a long set of phases until the Soviet Union toppled in 1991. From then on, as we understand, the Clinton administration and the Allies attempted to recruit the Yeltsin administration to privatize assets in the direction of their company's interests, and the oligarch class became a target for recruitment to controlling the regime. And Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Boris Berezovsky, both refugees now in London. Berezovsky didn't last quite as long as Khodorkovsky has done, but there are others too, have been plotting all these years to overthrow and take back what they consider to be their birthright in Moscow. So that part of the war has been brewing all along as Putin took over from Yeltsin, and as the Russian recovery, both economic and military, began to find again a relatively obvious set of national interests in Europe and in the world. These reflect business calculations, the nature of the Russian economy in the world, and so on. All of that's now been unraveled, as has the power of the oligarchs been unraveled. But during the 1990s and the 2000s, I was chronicling the way in which the oligarchs did business without any encouragement at all, and without any pickup at all from the organs that are now demonizing those very oligarchs today. Anyway, you can't say I was a prophet in my own country, because I had no country and I wasn't a prophet. I was simply trying to do the job of understanding the way things would go, because they must go this way, because there are political and economic interests fight each other and dictate the outcomes of state policy. This is what was happening, to put it very crudely. And so we come to the series of warnings since Putin's well-known speech in Munich in 2007. If you keep pushing us eastward with NATO expansion, as you promised not to do, if you keep threatening us with missile and other warfare that threaten our ability to balance our security at the nuclear strategic level, we must react. We must defend ourselves. That's been a simple message. And it's been ignored as the dynamics of NATO expansion are accelerated. They accelerated to the point at which the government in Kiev was overthrown hours after an agreement to have a democratic transition had been reached and signed by such notable Russian haters as Radek Sikorski, the then foreign minister of Poland. Now, with the change of regime in Kiev in February 2014, you have a new Ukrainian energy to take back, take on the Russian bear. At the same time, you have the Russian reaction, which is to protect its naval base in the Crimea. and the beginning of the secession movements in the Donbass, in Lugansk and Donetsk. Then you have an acceleration of civil war in the Ukraine, in which the Poroshenko regime mounts a major so-called anti-terrorist operation, ATO, which triggers the shoot-down of MH17. And then we're on a steady escalation of sanctions, counter-sanctions, and economic warfare, which become the world war on the Russian economy. I'm trying to simplify things, Matt, and I hope I'm not leaving out anything you think important, but the story of the MH17 lie is fully published now, and it's a big fat book, and one can understand how much of a lie that one was. But that was July 2014, and we've had steady escalation of murder directed at the people of Donetsk and Lugansk ever since.
Yeah.
And then we had, so between then and February 2022, this year, we have this escalation and the belief on the part of the general staff in Moscow, the political leadership in Moscow. It's not Putin's individual idea. It's a general Russian appreciation that the threat had become so close, so militarily threatening as an invasion of Russian territory that the special military operation was launched preemptively, preemptive defense, with the objective of achieving on the gun platform that calls itself Ukraine, or the Galician-led gun platform, demilitarization, denazification. Denazification is the reference to World War II ideology, but it's the same reference to the Galician leadership in the Lvov region, which Miss Freeland represents in English in Canada. Now, what do we have now? We have a situation in which the world is at war in Europe. The world is at war with the Russian economy, and we have a very, very serious situation in which it becomes essential to understand the difference between the truth and the lies.
Mm-hmm. No, that's very well said, and I think the thumbnail sketch is vital, and people can work out the details. And if anyone is listening who doesn't believe in any element of what you're saying, I dare them prove John wrong. Do the research and see if he's actually right. Because I can tell you, the thing that caught my eye with you, John, and originally when I was beginning to just read your stuff, it was, I think, your work on Freeland and your sensitivity to how the long waves of history are shaping our current world that was very rare. And I had been looking at Chrystia as well, but from a different angle. And from my standpoint, she triggered alarm bells when she became a factor in play coming out of Reuters. And, all of a sudden she was being brought in by a Rhodes Scholar named Bob Ray, who sat in her riding. And he actually gave up his seat so that she could take his seat in the elections in 2013. And she herself, being a Rhodes Scholar, that was what made my alarm bells go off a little bit, because I don't appreciate the influence that the Rhodes Scholarship Program, the Cecil Rhodes Milner Group, have played in 20th century. I mean, the entire 20th century has been made a disaster largely because of the influence of these networks, both in the United States and especially in Canada, and I would imagine in Australia too. But I wasn't really properly appreciating the Nazi connection. And when you started writing about Michael Chomiak, her grandfather, at first the weight of it didn't quite move me appropriately. And I didn't appreciate to what degree it was sort of like, in my mind, when I read that, I was like, oh, not a surprise, still living in the traditions of darkness in her family, but I was still treating it like trivia. And it was only over the recent years that I began to fully appreciate that, no, something major was not resolved in after World War II. And as you pointed out, the current attempt to break up Russia and subdue them really has a lot to do with what was decided upon in 1945 by those who we thought were the victor nations, which actually ended up absorbing a lot of the highest level Nazis and fascists into Allen Dulles' CIA, into MI6. And many of these Ukrainian Nazis were given not only safe haven, but put to work, creating, reconstructing in many ways a lot of their intelligence networks, as we've seen with Gehlen and the whole Gehlen apparatus in West Germany, but also Chrystia Freeland's father, I'm sure, wasn't just a farmer in Alberta. I'm pretty sure you'll find all sorts of other things, along with many other Ukrainians in Canada who were given safe haven. But this maintained itself as third and even fourth generation romanticism over the idea that Stalin and Russia were the big bad villains of World War II, and the Nazis weren't really all that bad, according to a lot of these creeps. And you start really just appreciating just how much has been unresolved from World War II that I think Putin really does want to finally resolve, ideally in his lifetime, and ideally maybe even maybe very soon. But what do you think of that? Like, do you think that it's possible to finally wrap up and undo the damage of the growth of these Nazi romantic ideas that not only are they there in Ukraine, but they're also we see it in Poland, in Estonia, so many of these Eastern European, Latvia, many of these countries, many of whom are NATO members, many of whom are even calling for having nuclear weapons, like Poland, have a certain romantic relationship with fascist ideas. Do you think that this could really be resolved finally if Russia plays their cards wisely going forward?
I give you a short answer, Matt, and then a longer one.
Okay.
The answer is no. These are emotions and ideas that long predate the arrival of the German Nazi movement of Hitler. They go back in the long history of the contest between European states and European peoples and European religions. So let me come back, and that cannot be overcome by cleansing the mind, re-brainwashing, de-ideologizing, or even, in a certain sense, denazification. That you can't ultimately change minds. You can create secure zones in which this kind of mind can't threaten its neighbors and bring the rest of Europe into war. The fundamental war is over whether Europe will be part of a US-led empire, rules-based international order, Ms. Freeland calls it, as Canadian policy. It's different from a Europe in which Germany, Russia, France, Italy, and the UK are the dominant leaders of Europe, and in which the European economy finds its place in the world somewhat differently. But let me go back to a couple of things you said originally, Matt. You've done terrific work on Rhodes Scholars and the Rhodes Scholarship, and I have to say this should help people to understand the way in which the ideological formation, the alliance that people's minds have with either the British way of seeing the future of the world and Europe and Britain itself, or the United States. And this was not exactly an ideological choice on my part, but I refused to become a Rhodes Scholar. It happened kind of accidentally when I was still in late teenage, and I was finishing my honors year in my university and was called to become one of the Rhodes Scholar candidates for that year. And I was we were briefed, the potential candidates, on how to eat ice cream at the dining table of the governor of the state of Victoria. And I was told then that a likely Rhodes Scholar candidate ate ice cream with a fork. Wow, I thought, a fork, eh? I thought we did it with a spoon. And I said, disrespectfully, that I would keep my fork and my spoon and take them to Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I believed then, as a teenager, 18, 19, that the future was to be understood, if we all had a future, we were in the Vietnam War at the time, in the United States. So I rejected the Ord Scholarship, though I must tell you, folks, I still eat ice cream with a fork. I've never had the privilege of cutting my ice cream with a titled aristocrat, nor a governor of the British Empire, but I still eat ice cream with a fork, and I don't feel ideologically changed for it. I did, however, win the Frank Knox Fellowship to Harvard. That was set up by a former US Navy secretary to recruit promising members of the British Empire to go to Harvard. And one of my fellow Knox fellows was, if I'm not mistaken, what's her name? The British woman who became the Trump National Security Advisor for Russia. I've suddenly forgotten her name. Anyway, I opted against the Rhodes Scholarship and indoctrination at Oxford, and I chose to be indoctrinated at Harvard. And the rest is kind of history, but ideologically speaking, I thought the future lay with the US Empire, not the British Empire. And the problem for all us little people in the world was to understand which empire was going to give us our running orders. And that's how it started for me. But thanks to you, Matt, I've got a much clearer idea of what would have happened to me if I'd gone to Oxford.
Well, I did. You definitely, but you dodged that bullet very well.
Thank you. And I, as I say, the ice cream still makes it the distance between the plate and my mouth when I eat it. But I tell the story again because little people at some age do have a choice about which empire to join, just as many of my age might have decided to opt for the Soviet Union and for communist education. Many people in Africa did, many people in Asia did, and so on. I made my choice and I've had to live with it and learn from it. And that's the point. Yeah. The issue, however, you raised, Matt, is can a deeply rooted conviction that some people are evil on the other side, whether they be Russian Orthodox by religion or whether they be Russian speakers or Russian by ethnicity, positively evil now, just as the German doctrine cast that particular label at the Jewish people, and Israel casts that label at the Palestinian people. Can these doctrines, can these deep-rooted hatreds be resolved? I don't believe they can. What can be resolved is the threat of such thinking in warfare in Europe, in warfare in the Arab world, in warfare in Asia. Now, to go back to your question, how does one minimize the threat to others that the Galicians of Lvov, the Freelandites, how does one mitigate the threat to everyone else in Europe from their hatred? One of the things you can do is reduce the amount of money you pay them to perpetrate their hatred, arm their hatred. Galicia is now a highly prosperous gun platform, trading in weapons, pointing in weapons, training in weapons, using weapons, and so on.
Right.
What's the future for this little gun gang? Well, let's look at the way the Middle East has gone and what's happened to the Arab world in its relationship with Israel. The last book I wrote, the last book I published, is called The Jackal's Wedding. And it tells the story of the destruction of the secular Arab regimes in the Middle East between 1940 and roughly speaking 1980. It stops before Saddam Hussein was overthrown and executed. It stops before Muammar Gaddafi was removed in Libya and murdered. It stops before the Assad family defends Syria in the civil war. But the sad outcome of that book is that secular Arabism was destroyed in that period by a combination of US and Israeli power. Is that the fate of the Russian people in Europe? That's a question you have to ask. And is it the solution to the current conflict that we can cure people of their hatred? I'd say you can't. You can only reduce the ability of the haters on either side to hurt each other and hurt the rest of us. And that requires a different architecture of security in Central and Eastern Europe than the one that the Polish regime in Warsaw, the German regime in Berlin, the regime in Kiev, and so on, currently anticipate. Now, why is that? Well, the answer is simple. Politicians make the same calculations, the same short-term calculations of power and money that businessmen do. We all must. Life's too short. We all aren't going to live forever, and we have to solve our pressing needs. It pays for the Warsaw regime to stoke the conflict next door. It pays the regime in Berlin to do the same, and so on and so on and so on. Now, it's a terrible situation now, and I'm sure my French, German, Italian, Polish colleagues will all agree, never for a very long time, certainly not since 45, have the regimes in each of these capitals, London, Warsaw, Paris, Rome, and Berlin, been so weak, divided politically, divided ideologically, divided economically. And in that weakness, it's been relatively easy for a faction in Washington, the faction led by Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and his Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, to mobilize their alliance against Russia. Yeah. And so it pays them all, just as it pays Zelensky and his predecessors. It's paid them, it pays them now to go on fighting. To go on fighting requires going on hating. This is, did I leave out the weakness in London? The stupidest prime minister in British history that I can recall is now in London, and she's demonstrated her colossal stupidity at the expense of British people within weeks. Yeah. Now, these kinds of divisiveness, spineless Chancellor of Germany like Olaf Scholz, divided power in Paris under Mr. Macron, attempting to inflict some of the worst authoritarian measures on the French since Vichy. Can these regimes find an incentive economically or politically to make the kind of, let's say, non-aggression pact that's required to end the war in the Ukraine? No, they can't. In particular, why should they if the Ukrainians are going to do all the dying and the Americans will do all the pain?
Yeah. No, that's a very strong point. And I find it too. I mean, it's wild the amount of mediocrity that it's like a perfect storm of mediocrity all striking the political class of the West at the same time. And the only sane voices that I could seem to find anywhere in the German landscape, at least that have any clout, or even in France, are primarily located within the business community, who recognizes that they're going to be completely wiped out. They seem to have some clout and some connections and contacts with Russian counterparts. I'm hoping that, and maybe you could say something about this, I'm hoping that these more rational, self-interested groupings have some clout within the political class that they could call upon or mobilize in the face of what's going to be a very dark and deadly winter for many, many millions of people who are being subjected to, and potentially even worse, if things get out of hand on the hot war front of things. I don't think that that's necessarily as big of an issue, and maybe I'm wrong, but certainly there will be mass freezing to death and scarcity of foodstuffs that is just out of hand. Is there any way that you think that that Russia and Germany, perhaps that a saner orientation within Germany might arise? And I say this because in your recent post you made a point that there is an anomaly, that for the first time in a very long time, after this recent sabotage of certain German rail lines, there was not an immediate jump to blame Russia for once. And this really does stand out, including also, Nord Stream 2 having been sabotaged. And I'm sure very many Germans are very unhappy by that sabotage, since they also don't want to freeze to death. Do you think that there's any way that a German-Russian, even with the mediocrity in government now, friendship might be a basis upon which something more constructive could occur for all of Europe? Or do you think that it's too far gone with the political class being not able to speak and negotiate with Russians at this point?
Well, if I were a diplomat, and I'm not, I'd say there's always hope for negotiated outcomes. Matt, I'd have to say no diplomat would ever say there's no hope. No soldier, and I'm not one of those, would always say the same. If I were a priest, and I'm not one of those either, one would always express the hope that a better outcome than is being discussed in Germany, in Berlin, for example, right now, or in Paris, or in London, or in Warsaw, or in Rome. I'm not going to say there's no hope, but I'm in a profession that, and you recited them, I've been through politics, I've been through the law and court litigation, and now I'm a journalist for my sins. These aren't professions in which you act on hope. You act on risk, you act on the law, you act on what you expect will be done to you to mitigate its negatives and take advantage of the positives. So I try to be practical. Is there a way out for the Poles who don't like the millions of Ukrainians absorbing the country's resources and will not be able to cope with another million or 2 or 3 or 4 that will pour across the border into Poland, heading for Germany when the lights go out and Ukraine begins to freeze, if that happens? Is there any way of convincing the spineless Chancellor of Germany and his green allies, Baerbock, the foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany, and Robert Habeck, the minister of economics in Germany? Are they really willing to fight, as Baerbock has said, to the limit in Ukraine, no matter what price the Germans will pay? Well, it's up to the Germans to express themselves, and they are. And the old East German versus West German, prosperity versus communism split that was reunified but has not healed, is emerging. And right now you can see that the public opinion in Germany has gone directly towards the Alliance for Germany, the right-wing group, rather than any of the left-wing alternatives.
Yes.
Does that mean Nazism? No, it doesn't. Does that mean fascist ideology? Well, fascism has popped up before this conflict all over the world, hasn't it? Didn't we learn how fascism pops up in all our states, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, when we saw emergency powers inflicted on vast populations at great sacrifice? Were those measures, were the emergency powers used during the pandemic and still used in Europe, in France, in Germany, and so on? Are these the structures of fascism as we used to define it when we went to school and learned? Well, I'd say more or less yes. So the ability of, let's say, regime to inflict sacrifice, pain, and suffering has already been tested since 2020 with the COVID-19 pandemic emergency measures. And I did a little book about a little litigation about the way fascism came to this provincial state in Australia called Victoria, and the little Hitler who still runs that state and will get shortly re-elected in power. So I'm not hopeful, to go back to your question, Matt, that populations freezing to death will be any more resistant or capable of changing the political regime that rules them than populations dying of COVID-19 were able to for the last 2 years. Why should I be hopeful? If the COVID-19 pandemic years proved you could inflict death on such large populations, and you could destroy the medical system, the national health system of the UK, the French medical system, and so on and so forth. Did we see compliance, passivity unto death in those places? I'm afraid the answer is yes. So why should we expect revolution in the streets when people start to freeze cold or can't pay their energy bills or whatever in these countries? Why should we expect revolution? Well, I'm afraid the answer is we can't.
Well, I think that it is important to have a strong, sober sense of the reality in the situation as it is, and people do need to take very seriously right now some deep lessons of history, some deep lessons of their own role in a process. And I know for myself, it was a positive experience that I didn't anticipate to have. I'm hoping for more such surprises. When I was there on the ground in Ottawa in February of this year, and I did see with my own eyes something I didn't think possible regarding the truckers' convoy, and millions of people were there, conglomerated from across Canada. And I think we've all seen the videos. I didn't think there was much of that sort of spirited character within the Canadian population that had been a population that had been known for its being very docile and pleasant, not really one to stand up to tyranny. The effects of that have been generally interesting. We definitely need leadership, and we don't have that right now. We have a lot of people who don't want to die, who have a certain sense of self-interest or self-preservation, but not a lot of sense of an understanding of what has brought us here. And again, the political class, those who are attempting to lead the masses at this moment of crisis, are, as we've said now again and again, mediocre and incompetent at best, and outright soulless at worst. That is not a good situation. That definitely needs to change. Do you think that right now, I guess I'll end the last question here on the Eurasian multipolar versus the transatlantic rules-based international orderistas, and the two opposing paradigms? What are your views? A lot of people are saying right now in the alternative media landscape that, Putin and the multipolar orientation, the Greater Eurasian Partnership, is just a controlled opposition. Don't bother thinking about that as being a real resistance. Do you think that something actually new and better is being fought for and brought online from an economic and security point of view from the multipolar Eurasian Partnership and their allies? Or what would you say to those people who say, oh, it's all controlled, it's all go back to sleep? What are your thoughts on such people?
Good questions, Matt, and we're running out of time to cover them all. Maybe we'll do it another time.
Sure.
But the part of the Canadian political story that has to be addressed now, and it would help with the answer. The word is racism. The ethnocentrism, the white racism that manifested itself as a form of resistance to emergency power during the pandemic is a very unpleasant symptom of what we have in Canada today and what has to be remedied.
Are you talking about the pictures of like the swastika flag bearing person in Ottawa?
Well, let's remember that before the trucker convoy, there was a major and highly successful First Nations series of protests, which stopped the railroads moving east to west, right? The First Nations campaigns to protect their land and interests in the West were basically stopped by the pandemic, the arrival of the pandemic, and in their place, as you said, Matt, a lot of leaderless resistance with many different causes emerged instead. Now, in my opinion, and I'm speaking as a stranger, I'm speaking as an outsider. I don't understand Canadian politics, and I don't purport to say I do. But the problem of race hatred, which now reflects itself in Europe as war against Russia, which reflected itself as race hatred in the war against the Arabs, which I've spoken of briefly. This race hatred has to be resolved in Canada, and it has to be resolved in order that an accommodation between Canada and China, an accommodation between Canada and the African states can be reached, and an accommodation reflecting an alliance, the alliance that Russia is trying to form and preserve with the disparate elements in India. And I'm not going to get into, I don't pretend to understand the divisive elements in Indian politics, which have introduced themselves into Ottawa politics. But let's be clear, hatred, race hatred, and racism are easy methods for dividing a unified opposition, whether the opposition is resistance to the emergency powers of the pandemic to save our lives from the virus, or whether they're emergency powers designed to save our purported lives, heating and jobs and income and so forth from the so-called evil Russians. Race hatred is a disaster where it's not a mobilizing device. It's a mobilizing device for ruling and continuing the present catastrophe on its present path.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's true. And that is one of the biggest intellectual moral blocks amongst many Canadians and Americans that I know regarding their ability to see how to put out the current fire, is that they unfortunately have been very receptive to misinformation, which is all over the place, to try to position the cause of all of our woes and all of the problems facing Canadians and Americans on virtually every level to the big bad communist Chinese who are out to destroy Western democracy and Christianity and subdue our our world under their totalitarian hegemony. It's really big. It's the quickness and that people leap to this presumption, and is very disappointing, considering the fact that China has created, despite the faults one can always enumerate, has created one of the most vibrant, powerful, independent economic powers that we've ever seen, independent of the IMF, the World Bank, the City of London financiers, and Wall Street. And they're able to carry out the sorts of massive building of economic development projects and mega projects that we used to do way before I was born. I mean, in the 50s, 60s, maybe some 70s, and then we just stopped doing anything. We can't do it. We can't do anything anymore. China does it. And they've been wanting to work with the West as allies in economic development, just as they are with Russia and with China and other countries. And we've so far been refused to properly see this as an opportunity to get out of this fire. So I agree with you. There's definitely a lot of latent, subconscious, deep prejudice and racism, which is there. That is an issue.
If we're speaking in Montreal to a Canadian French audience, then they can remind us of the terrible prejudice that the Francophone Canada suffered from the Anglophone and British Empire Canada. It's time to remember that. It's time to remember some of the achievements of Pierre Trudeau in establishing Canada's independence in the world. And it's time to remember the kind of resistance that some great Canadians have shown. I try to say the greatest Canadian I've known of in modern times was Glenn Gould, the pianist, the great pianist who regrettably died young in 1982. Anglo, to be sure. But that man, as a boy, resisted the demands of Lester Pearson, then Foreign Minister of Canada, who was taking the orders of Washington to tell Gould, you are not going to play your piano in Moscow and St. Petersburg, when he was invited to do so during the height of the Cold War. And that young Canadian said politely, to hell with you. Mm-hmm. That great Canadian played the piano like it had never been played in Moscow.
That's good. Yeah, I've just purchased some tickets for a Tchaikovsky performance in Montreal in a few weeks. So hopefully there's still some artistic rebelliousness here in the Montreal art scene. So hopefully that could be contagious for other people.
Hope so.
Thank you so much for taking the time and going through some really important lessons in history and our current present age. If people want to get a hold of your books, you have written several major books. I have a copy of your most recent. I've been flipping through. It's incredible, going through Western intelligence agencies and the manipulation of the Arab world, and much more than that, really, that you co-wrote with your wife, Claudia Wright. The Jackal's Wedding, American Power, Arab Revolt. All of that is available on johnhelmer.net. All of the links are going to be available in the description box under this video. Is there anything else, any parting words you'd like people to leave with?
Oh, parting words. That's more difficult than any question you've asked me, Matt. My parting words would be that I hope to see you all again soon, and I hope we're alive. Regrettably, Claudia Wright's dead. Regrettably, the Arabs of the Jackal's Wedding are all dead. Let's hope that we stay alive.
Amen to that, John. Amen to that. I'm looking forward to a future conversation with you. This was very interesting. And till then, if anybody else wants to check out more of our Canadian Patriot podcast, I invite you to go to canadianpatriot.org for more of that. John, till next time, take care.
Thank you.